as it were. But I think that when people it has to do with the fact that people are having, it should be anger and a desire to not just mourn but organize.
That's Jeff Yang. He's an opinion writer for CNN. Jeff, thank you for saying an anchor for BBC World News America. She's also the author of several books, including her latest, Living the Confidence Code, Real Girl.
We get real hard pressed to admit that perhaps the hatred,
violence against women. Do we have an outpouring of press attention?
And whether they're taking harassment and abuse seriously. Women have experienced physical or sexual violence from a partner and haven't made much progress, specifically
For a brief instant, we'll feel sad or angry or empathic. But none of these people came yesterday. Some of the women who were killed were immigrants who had been in this country for decades. Some of them in their 60s and 70s. And their story now is being told not because people knew who they were, but because people know them as statistics.
I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. Please go ahead.
I don't want to turn this into a rant, as it were, but I think that when people really try to immerse themselves a little bit more in what Americans are going through, a lot of it has to do with the fact that people are treating this as if this is a surprise, that it's a shock, that these things occur in their midst, right? They're and that includes Asian Americans. I think that we should be at a point right now where we recognize that surprise is not really the reaction we should be having. It should be anger and a desire to not just mourn but organize.
That's Jeff Yang. He's an opinion writer for CNN. Jeff, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Jen.
It's Women's History Month, and a recent report from the World Health Organization shows that abuse against women has remained at the same level for a decade. Why haven't we managed to move the needle? And after centuries of telling women to cover up and protect themselves, is it time for men to get it together? Mickey Kendall is the author of Hood Feminism and Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists. Mickey, welcome back to the show.
thank you for having me on again.
Also with us, Katty Kay, an anchor for BBC World News America. She's also the author of several books, including her latest, Living the Confidence Code, Real Girls, Real Stories, Real Confidence. Katty, welcome.
Ben, thank you for having me.
So the two of you were listening along, and we've only got a couple of minutes before we got to go to break, but I just want to get your reaction to what we heard in that prior conversation. Mickey?
I'm going to try to say this as delicately as I can because I've been watching people make excuses for a long time now. Every time we have a moment of white supremacist violence in America, there's an excuse, there's an explanation. He's a lone wolf, and I'm not sure how many lone wolves we get before we admit that this is less wolves and more worms turning and more violence that is being normalized. I listened to a cop say he was having a bad day, and you know, if you remember the shooting in the church, I heard a cop say that about Dylan Roth, that he was going through a hard time. You know what I do when I have a bad day? I have a glass of wine and I read a good book. Take a bath. I maybe have some chocolate. Sometimes it's bourbon. I don't pick up a weapon and go out on a killing spree. What is happening here is a hate crime. What has been happening is hate crimes. And because sometimes they involve women, we get real hard pressed to admit that perhaps the hatred
has fallen in the UK, not risen. I mean, despite the Me Too movement, despite a lot of conversations around violence towards women a couple of years ago, actually the situation for women in terms of being able to get justice for people who perpetrate rape against them or perpetrate violence against them, that's got worse. So what's happened? I mean, I thought what Jeff said really earlier was so powerful. Do we just forget every time? Do we have, every time there is an instance of social justice, whether it's around racial equity, whether it's around gender, whether violence against women, do we have an outpouring of press attention and politicians' attention and our own attention, only to then move on to the next instance or the next wave of violence against somebody else? And at what point do we stop forgetting? But
we've been talking a lot about technology and
hey, this thought that we may not be safe walking home in the dark alone.
Mickey, demonstrators have said they're sick of people to protect themselves, that at this point it's up to men to figure out why men commit violence and fix it. What is it like for you that we're still saying that in 2021?
So I'm gonna tell a brief story for a second. I was in the military, and I'm a girl who fights. I'm a girl who absolutely knuckles out. I was in my barracks room, and I was attacked in the barracks room. And then my command said, well, you should have, right, and you can insert the list here. And I'm gonna say this, after all these years of hearing shoulda, coulda, woulda, and I got out of the military years ago, in decades, we are no longer in a position where we should be pretending that there is a shoulda, coulda, woulda that would have prevented a violent person from being violent, that a victim can enact. There are gun laws we don't have. There are consequences for police officers we don't have, because the second most common form of police brutality in America is sexual violence. I don't know the stats for the UK, but I would bet that they look a lot like ours on that front. And every time we have these incidents, someone says, well, victims should have. Sarah Everard, I looked her up. She was dressed in the clothes they say women should wear. She was killed by someone who theoretically you're supposed to be able to go to for safety. She's not even the only person that has had that happen, right? We saw this in New York, where cops were assaulting rape victims and domestic violence victims. We saw it in Chicago, we saw it in LA, we see it in India, we see it in all of these places. It's a global problem. So why are we still looking at the people who are more likely to be victims of violence and telling them what they can do as a solution, and not talking to the people who are more likely to commit that violence? It might actually go somewhere if we focused on violence prevention in terms of misogyny.
I'm really sorry you had that experience, Mickey. Really sorry you had that experience. Caddy, talk about the point Mickey made there about the role law enforcement plays here and whether they're taking harassment and abuse seriously.
Well, I think it trickles down from the statistics that show us that when people do report a rape or an incident of sexual harassment, overwhelmingly women don't feel either that they're going to be believed or that they're going to get some sense of justice. So to the extent that police are part of a system which is not giving women belief or justice, it's understandable that women don't necessarily believe that male police officers in particular, are going to protect them. And that is why women don't come forward. We saw this, we had this conversation around the time of Me Too, and I'm not sure that women's confidence that they will be believed or that somebody will be charged and prosecuted and that justice will be done in instances of abuse or rape or violence has actually grown very much. Those statistics in the UK suggest that actually our chances of getting retribution, our chances of getting justice have declined. They haven't increased, they've declined, despite all the conversations that we would have had. And I think Mickey's exactly right. The conversation needs to shift away from women. It's not our responsibility to have to carry a pair of keys as we walk down the street. It's not our responsibility to check that the street lights are working, that the bulb hasn't gone out in the street light outside our house. It is that the onus has to be on the people who are perpetrating the violence. And in the case of Sarah Everard, clearly the onus has to be on law enforcement to do a better job of protecting us.
Well, in a report released last week by the World Health Organization, they found that 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence from a partner in her lifetime. They also found that number has remained largely unchanged for a decade. Kenny, what do you make of the fact that after a decade we haven't made much progress, specifically around intimate partner violence?
Well, one of the tragedies of the pandemic, both here in the US and around the world, both for women and for girls, has been the uptick in domestic violence because of the pandemic, because women are stuck at home and they can't get out, and because girls are stuck at home and they can't get out. There's a terrifying report has just come out of Asia, came out just yesterday, showing that the number of girls who have been put into child marriages in the Asia Pacific region was 2.5 times last year from the previous year. And that is a direct result of the pandemic. So girls are not going to school. They don't have a safe place to go anymore. They're more likely to be put into child marriages, and they're more likely to be the victims of violence. And that's a direct response of COVID. The impact of COVID on women and girls in particular around the world is going to be devastating. We're going to lose a generation of education for young girls in many countries, and that's a direct result of the pandemic that's not being addressed. That's been kind of overlooked as we all, we're all so focused, I know, on our own situation during the pandemic, but it's pretty rough for girls out there right now, and the situation of violence is also rough. We know that for women and for girls.
Mickey, I want to hear your thoughts, especially since we know here in the U.S. job losses disproportionately impacted women. Cut wages have disproportionately impacted women. How does this issue of women bearing the economic brunt of the pandemic fit into this larger conversation?
So in the larger conversation, what happens when you are trying to leave an abusive situation is you need money. You need a job, you need to be able to afford rent, you need to be able to afford all of these things, right? We don't have the safety nets in place that we had 20 years ago when I was in a bad situation. So we are now seeing the beginning whispers of what will happen, I suspect, for the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, which will be women who are pushed out of the workforce because of childcare, because of COVID, because of job loss, will then be in situations where they can't afford to leave a person who is abusing them because they won't have anywhere to go. We've also seen things like subsidized housing gutted, subsidized childcare gutted. We're seeing a lot of these things, the early warning signs right now. In addition, because we are seeing that going to police doesn't help for basically anything, the police apparently are a source of violence more likely than a protection from it. We're going to see people who just don't report. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to ask for help? Right? We had Daniel Holtzclaw in Oklahoma rape at least 18 women, I think, of what he was convicted of. We have seen all of these other incidents. We've seen at every single turn when women report, for the most part, I think it's been like 1% may get some form of justice from the system, but also no support. And if you are a victim of domestic violence, you're more likely to be a victim, on top of all of these other things. So what we're looking at is a situation where people who are in a bad situation already because of whatever interpersonal things can't go to the system because the system will make their situation worse, and can't even rely on the labeled bootstraps because we cut the bootstraps. So where now are they supposed to go, and how are they supposed to navigate this?
I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. We're talking to authors Mickey Kendall and Caddy Kay about violence against women and Women's History Month. So often when I think about the conversations I have about this issue, it's conversations I'm having with women. And as we think about how to shift the conversation to focus not on what women are or aren't doing, but rather to the role misogyny plays, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how we shift that conversation. Caddy?
You know, one of the things that surprised, I think, all of us when the conversation about violence against women and harassment of women in the workplace really came to the fore a few years ago was how little men knew about that reality, right? I think every single woman of my age, in my mid-50s, who has worked in a professional organization has been the subject of harassment or abuse on some level. I just don't have a single female friend of mine, who hasn't gone through some kind of incident. And yet, when that conversation was first raised a few years ago, I was stunned by how few men knew it was happening. And what happens is you've got a few men who are perpetual abusers, and who perpetrate 80% of the crimes against women, and about 80% of men who are sort of unaware. Now, it's their job to be aware, and we shouldn't have to tell them every single time. But it really struck me how little men were involved in a conversation that women were having on a daily basis amongst themselves. And unless men are involved in that conversation and take it upon themselves to be educated about what's happening, I don't think we make much progress, because we have to have men as allies in this, and we have to have men as part at the table talking about what other men are doing to women.
Mickey, your thoughts?
I have a small quibble. I don't think it's that 80% of men are unaware. I think that 80% of men don't care unless they're made to care. They think that the jokes that they laugh at, the guy that they brush off as a danger, the friend that they say, oh, he's just a little weird, but he likes you, he's really harmless. They don't think of women who are not directly related to them as people, all too often. And even when they do, they tend to think and make excuses for, which we just saw in Atlanta and we see over and over again. He was having a bad day, he's going through a hard time. If you can stand there and say in the face of a brutal murder spree, he had a bad day and this is what he chose to do, I think on some level we have a saying in U.S. pop culture, no humans involved, right? And we saw this in Chicago when 50 black women were murdered across 10 years. I have a suspicion that if you had asked some of the police officers in Georgia, we would hear a version of this. And we tend to think of it as the base, worst attitude for these sexist men to have. I would argue that it is an attitude that at different levels across the spectrum infiltrates our culture, so that we talk about violence against women of all races, but specifically violence against women of color as something that is
I think we are having a little bit of trouble with Mickey's line there, but I think we all understand her point. That was Mickey Kendall. She's the author of Hood
Freak. Ephemeral. That's been drying up for the first time in anyone's memory in early June.
We have a dollar for dollar match that's in effect right now, but only for the next 4 minutes. Get your contribution in right now, and the impact of that will be doubled thanks to some very generous GBH members. And with your contribution of $10 a month, we'll say thanks with the Babbel online learning app. It is the #1. Support for On Point comes from MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulate software for technical computing and model-based design. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at MathWorks.
languagenetworks.com. And Linguistica 360, whose mission is to make language learning as intuitive as listening to the news. From current events and culture to original stories. New episodes every week at newsandslowfrench.com, newsandslowitalian.com, and newsandslowspanish.com.
On Point is made possible by Maine Public Listener contributions and by Maine Education Association, supporting educators so they can inspire students now more than ever. Learn more at mainea.org. And by Green Lantern Solar, running turnkey solar solutions, schools, municipalities, and businesses.